Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sheila Bauman, and I'm the events planner for Kitchener Public Library, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's event. Before we begin the program, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. As we gather, we are reminded that the library is situated on land that is the traditional home of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. We also recognize the contributions Indigenous peoples have made in shaping and strengthening this community. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet here and reaffirm our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our community. At this time, I'd like to introduce tonight's interviewer and author, and following their bios, Annie will do a short reading from her book, then Carlos will join her on screen for a conversation. At 4 years old, Carlos Benavides was afraid of the dark, and to help combat that fear, his parents bought him a clock radio, which he still has, and the love affair with radio began. That 4-year-old wanted to be that person in the radio, providing comfort, connection, and companionship to others the way it did for him. In 1998, he started his radio career at the legendary 102.1 The Edge in Toronto. He moved to the lovely, scenic, beautiful Tri-Cities in 2003 to work at Dave FM on the Big Afternoon radio show, then to mornings on the Beat Breakfast on 91.5 The Beat in 2010. And in 2019, he made the transition to teaching and is now a broadcast radio professor, helping prepare the next generation of broadcasters and podcasters at Conestoga College. You can listen to Carlos Saturday mornings from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. and Chime 96.7. Having grown up in this region, I've listened to Carlos on my clock radio, which I no longer own, my car radio, and now through the internet. I've also bumped into him at work when he was part of our Reading Buddies program and when he spent time in a Hefner studio. I'm thrilled to welcome and host him this evening. Our special guest tonight, Annie Zaleski, is a music journalist who has had her work featured in numerous publications, including Rolling Stone, Billboard, and the Los Angeles Times. And she shared her impressive musical knowledge on NPR, CBC, and Sirius XM Canada. Her latest work is part of the Bloomsbury Publishing's 33 1/3 series of books, which is about popular music that provide history and context of individual albums and highlights their place in music history. In Annie's book, she details the importance and continued influence of Rio, Duran Duran's 1982 breakthrough album. You can find Annie on Twitter at Annie Zaleski and on Instagram at Annie Zaleski Author. At this time, this Gen X, forever 15-year-old, is going to sit back and listen and reminisce as Annie and Carlos talk everything Duran Duran. Welcome, Annie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for being the first Canadian stop. We appreciate that.
Absolutely. I am very happy. So I'm going to do a small reading from my book right now. And so to kind of set the scene, this is a scene where so just to back up a little bit, I was able to talk to 4 of the 5 band members who were in Duran Duran circa Rio. And so this excerpt is talking a little bit about their influences and kind of, how they were kind of their mindset as sort of they were starting to make Rio. So I'm going to start from right here. Although the elaborate Rio era videos gave people the impression Duran Duran were ruthless capitalists or Thatcherites, these clips were filmed after Rio was complete, but before the LP was a worldwide blockbuster. While recording the album, the band members weren't jaded jet setters, but hopeful dreamers. The cosmopolitan and escapist vibe permeating the Rio LP is aspirational, rooted in sincerity and earnestness. It was all unconscious how we did it. We certainly didn't sit down and plan that we were going to make this album of escapism and aspiration, says bassist John Taylor. No conversations were had to that effect. But subconsciously, all the lives that we had all lived up to that point all got sort of poured into it and expressed. Duran Duran believed in themselves and believed they could actually manifest these glamorous and exciting lives because they had tangible role models. There was a lot of confidence in what we were doing, Taylor continues. I mean, an extraordinary amount of confidence, the kind of confidence that only we could have gotten in Britain at that time, really. And I don't mean confidence of like, hey man, we got this, he adds, affecting a deliberately gruff vocal tone. Not gym confidence, just an innate sense of having spent the last 10 years of our lives watching bands like Pink Floyd and Roxy Music and the Sex Pistols and the Clash and David Bowie. Watching these extraordinary iconoclastic musicians and songwriters come out of Cambridge, Bromley, Shepherd's Bush, Newcastle, wherever. Taylor relays a story that mega AC/DC fan Andy Taylor, the band's guitarist, used to frequent the same bar in Newcastle as Brian Johnson, a musician who was in the band Geordie and later replaced Bon Scott as AC/DC's frontman. And the day Brian Johnson got the job in AC/DC, Andy was in the bar, and Brian Johnson bought around for everybody, he says. And for Andy, that was like, holy shit, someone from where I'm from can get that kind of recognition. That was beyond encouraging. I mean, talk about aspirational, the bassist continues. Aspiration is fine as long as there's some sense of real possibility there. I mean, if it's just a complete fucking fantasy, then that doesn't serve any purpose at all. But if it's grounded in enough energy or self-belief that you can actually build on that fantasy and make it a reality, then it's substantive. Taylor's perspective points to one reason why Duran Duran were so driven, so determined to make their escapist adventures come true. Some artists are content to revel in fantasy and possibility. It's akin to someone who pines after a crush and loses interest when feelings are reciprocated. Duran Duran not only loved the romance of the daydream, they also found beauty in the consummation, being able to visit those sunlit beaches and take in the magnificent vistas with their own eyes. And that's it.
Hi there, Annie. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. I'm very excited to talk to you. It's wonderful whenever you get a chance to really hear somebody read their work, because I mean, you have a great gift of making the words and the images just leap off the page. I mean, when I was reading the book, I felt like I was in 1982, back in high school, reliving a lot of things. And just to hear you read the book was fantastic. So thank you for that. And thank you for a great book. Before we begin, I have to do a shout out here because your mom's here. So shout out to your mom. And also, I love this wonderful message you had in the book. You dedicated the book to my husband, your permanent plus one, and your parents who never told you to turn down the music, which I think is amazing. So
that's correct. My formative musical experiences were all from their record collections and all from, stealing their tapes and CDs.
Right. What did you, now I need to know, what did you steal? Like, what was some sort of stuff that you got from your parents? You're like, whoa.
So my dad had a copy of the Joshua Tree by U2.
Oh,
and when I was in junior high, I basically absconded with that and I've never given it back. I think he had it on tape, but he loved U2. He loved the Cars. He loved the Police. But my parents also were really big into classic rock. My mom saw the Beatles. They saw the Who. I mean, they had like the grounding. They had everything cool,
right.
So their record collection was like unimpeachable.
That's
so I grew up with, a great household full of music and full of just, music all the time.
Yes. And this is a library event put on by the Kitchener Public Library. And you talk about this in your book. And I think it's wonderful because I want to explore this. But you talk about the audiovisual section of your beloved local library. Now, your parents had a great music collection, clearly. But there was stuff in that library that you just opened your mind even more. First of all, what was the name of the library and where was it?
So I grew up in a suburb called Rocky River, Ohio. It's kind of outside of Cleveland. And it was just the Rocky River Public Library.
Okay.
And it was like, it was literally a room. Like you would literally walk out of the elevators and you would turn and it was a room and it was full of racks of CDs and cassettes. And I think they had this was like before DVDs were even a thing. So they had VHS tapes, but it was amazing. They had obviously tapes that had been sitting there probably for 20 years, but they had Kraftwerk, they had the Velvet Underground and Nico, they had early U2, they had like all of this cool Cleveland underground, like indie rock. Like, I don't know, whoever they had Ultravox, I mean, which was just mind blowing for this. I mean, this is a boring suburb. This is a suburb that was, boring American suburb. Everyone was listening to, pretty, straight laced music. And I could go to my library and have my mind blown by these just classic records.
Right. Now, that wasn't where you discovered Duran Duran, was it? Was it in that library or was it a little bit later?
It was a little bit, I mean, I was the type of kid that went to the library every day after school. So
Yeah.
I know I took out Rio from the library. I know that because I have a cassette that I dubbed of it. But I kind of discovered Duran Duran via MTV and radio. So I was a little bit younger. So in the early 90s, I was a teenager and I would come home from school and watch MTV when I wasn't at the library. And this was at like when Ordinary World was big and Come Undone was a hit.
Right.
So I learned kind of all that stuff. And then also we had an alternative radio station in Cleveland, The End, who was playing 80s music and also the 90s stuff. So they played current Duran Duran and all of the awesome 80s stuff. And so I kind of came to the band, both eras of the band almost at the same time, which in hindsight was just an embarrassment of riches.
Well, that is because I'm thinking about the fact because I would have been in high school in 1982, grade 9, about the time that Duran Duran and Rio was released. So I was right in the thick of it. And we'll get to that in just a little bit because I read something in your book and I thought, oh my gosh, that's me and I'm 13 years old. But I'll explain in just a bit. I love origin stories. So what was yours with this book? Did Duran Duran find you through Bloomsbury, or did you find the story yourself and go out and get it? What was the impetus for this book specifically?
So it was me finding the story and then basically trying to convince Bloomsbury they should do this book. So Rio has this very elaborate backstory where, it was Duran Duran were big in England, they were big in Australia, and it took them a while to break in America. Every British band, like the Beatles, like the Stones, they wanted to break America. And so Rio, it took it took remixes, it took radio mixes, it took hard work. And so there was this kind of interesting backstory. The record was reissued a few times. But I discovered this story sometime in the 2000s at some point. I don't even know when. I mean, I'd always loved the record. And I started pitching this to the Bloomsbury's 33 1/3 series in 2007. And then I pitched it again in 2009. And they didn't take it either time. And so I put it away for a while. And then I was cranky because I'm like, I believed in this book. But there was a call. So they basically have a call for pitches every so often. It's kind of a, hey, we're taking proposals right now, put something together. And so the last time they did this was, I think, fall 2018. And I was like, I wasn't going to do it. And then a friend of mine was like, well, I might do this, but I decided not to. And I still had my proposal. And I said, you know what? I'm going to be really mad if someone pitches this and writes this book and it's not me. So I took the proposal and I kind of ripped it up and updated it and put it all together. And with 75 minutes to go before the deadline, I turned it in. And then a couple months later, I got an email and they were like, yes, we're going to greenlight this book. I started shaking because this has literally been something I've wanted to do for 15 years.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And at that point, how much groundwork, I know you talked about that there, but how much groundwork had you done? Had you done any interviews at that point, or were those to come essentially?
They were to come. Yeah, I had interviewed over the years. I had written about Duran Duran extensively for various websites. I'd interviewed John Taylor and I'd interviewed Nick Rhodes for tour press and things like that. And I had seen the band a million times, and I married someone who's a big Duran Duran fan. So it's, they've always been a real omnipresent part of my life. But so then when I got the green light for the book, I reached out to the band, and said, hey, I want to do this, kind of explained, I'd love to talk to anyone who'd be willing to talk about this. And they were actually in the early stages of making the record that's coming out in a couple of weeks. And so, but they were able to find time in their schedule to talk, and then the pandemic hit. But I'm just so grateful. I mean, this is something they've talked about Rio so many times over the years. They could have basically said, no, we're going to pass, but they took the time to talk to me, and it made for a better book. I'm just so grateful for that.
Yeah. There is going to be a Q&A during our webinar here. So if you have questions for Annie, please post them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those in just a little bit. I see one there from Sarah, so we'll get to your questions. So full disclosure here, Annie, I was not a fan in 1982 of Duran Duran. Okay, I'm gonna be transparent here. I think that's very important. Okay, as I mentioned, I was 13 in grade 9 at Silverthorne Collegiate Institute in Etobicoke, just outside of Toronto. So in many ways, I think it sounds a lot like your suburb in some ways of Cleveland. So I read something in your book that's just I like the press was skeptical of this band. Okay. All the girls love Duran Duran. John this, John that. And, I was a Thomas Dolby fan. I was a Thomas Dolby loving 13-year-old who thought he was amazing. Howard Jones, stuff like that. I thought, I don't understand this Duran Duran. But, and so sadly, as a 13-year-old is wont to do, I hated them. And you talk about this in your book, not as 13-year-olds, but, the male dominated critics, essentially. They hated Duran Duran. They hated Duran Mania about that. So just talk a little bit more about that. And just, I thought it was shocking, actually, to read that. I was 13. I thought it was just me. So.
It's funny how many people I've actually run into many people who said that when, that they were teenage boys around that time, and they were like, I didn't feel like we could be fans because all the girls liked it. And, this was like, we had to be different. And so you are not alone. But yeah, I think that was one of the most shocking things when I started really doing research, is that, on some level, instinctively, I knew that, there was, male rock critics really hated them. But when you actually went back and read some of the archival stuff, it was mean. It was stuff, making fun of what Simon Le Bon looked like. It was, kind of, making, like, basically poo-pooing the band, calling them lightweight, dismissing them as just a video band. And that was in the US. And the US, they definitely were a little bit more skeptical of the fans. The UK as well, just did not like the band. I mean, there are certain journalists that even to this day just have a bias against the band. And, you can see it because, there was jealousy. All of them were so extremely good looking. I'm absolutely sure jealousy had something to do with it.
I get it.
And they were confident, they knew what they were doing from almost the very start, and they knew what they were doing. They were like, this is what we're going to do. We're going to put out these videos that are maybe a little over the top. We're going to own it. They didn't apologize for anything. They were just so driven. And sometimes when you run into bands that are so ambitious and just so like, we're going to do this, people also kind of want to cut those bands down, because you want to be like, they come across as arrogant, even though they don't mean to. And so press don't like bands like that. And so there was a lot of that as well. But yeah, it's, it was just, in today's music journalism climate, that stuff would never fly. But 40 years ago, it was just all, gloves were on.
And that's crazy that you mentioned 40 years ago. This album does not seem, even though I'm looking back on it, it doesn't seem like it's a 40-year-old album. When you listen to it, and I've been listening to it quite a bit, it sounds pretty fresh right now for something that was produced 40 years ago. What is it about it that has that, I guess that, for lack of a better term, I mentioned it, freshness? It could be of this time, essentially.
I think there's a lot of factors that play into that. First off, the songwriting. The songwriting is just, when you look back at classic records that you listen to that are, 50 years old and, even longer, it's, why we're still listening to the Beatles, because their songs sound amazing. But along with that, there's the production. Colin Thurston, who produced this record, he worked with Bowie, he worked with the Human League. He just had a way, like, he managed to kind of bring out the best in the band without kind of putting his imprint on it. Some producers are really heavy-handed. He was not that type of person. He was really good about getting the best performances out of them. And the band has spoken very highly of him over the years and kind of their working relationship. And the fact too is that, you think of this record came out in 82. So it's, a quote unquote 80s record, but it's it's the instrumentation, it's guitar, bass, drums, and keyboards. It's not necessarily, synth pop. They don't necessarily have like a lot of the new trickery, like the Fairlight really wasn't, they weren't using a Fairlight or anything. They weren't really using, the production tricks that kind of date records. This was like a record that came out just before bands really started doing that. So it was really kind of an organic record with some electronic flourishes. So it sounded futuristic, but it sounded of its time, but also kind of futuristic. That's also Duran Duran. They have this bizarre alchemy you can't explain, that when they start playing together, they sound only like themselves. And they come up with the sound, and this is what makes bands great, is that you just can't explain why they sound the way they do. And Duran Duran has that.
Yeah. And you talk about that too in the book, about how they straddle, and you mentioned it here, they straddle that line between pop and rock that nobody else was quite doing, because they talk about their influences. John would talk about how much he loved AC/DC, for example. And I think anybody you talk to and said, well, wait a second, Duran Duran, somebody in Duran Duran actually liked AC/DC. I mean, but I think the more you talk to and you read this book, you realize their influences were pretty wide, pretty varied, which led to their success.
And that's, and on some level I knew that. And when I actually read interviews and kind of talked to them, they are such music fans. To this day, they're music fans. But when you listen, when they talk about, here's all the stuff they were listening to, I mean, I think they all agreed on Roxy Music and Bowie, but then everyone else had disparate things. Simon Le Bon saw a double bill of Joy Division and The Cure in the late 70s. And besides the fact that I would like a time machine to go to that too,
please.
But he has that moodiness, and Andy Taylor was the rocker. He was the Keith Richards. He liked, I think he's like Van Halen, Black Sabbath, like Jeff Beck. He was that classic British guitarist. Nick Rhodes liked disco, the whole rhythm section like disco. John and Roger, they wanted to be David Bowie's rhythm section, or Chic and Japan, and and Nick Rhodes like dance music and like Kraftwerk. So they'd have this really interesting kind of blend of all their different influences that all kind of came together.
Again, anybody have any questions for Annie, please post them for you in the Q&A and we'll get to those. You talked about confidence a little while ago. Compare the confidence of Duran Duran to perhaps some other bands that you have interviewed over time. Are they the most confident band? Do they straddle the line pretty well between confident and cocky to the point where they're not off-putting? How would you classify Duran Duran?
See, Duran Duran over the years has mellowed significantly, I would say. So when you read them in 1981, they are just kind of, they're the typical, because they were kids. Like when they were making Rio, Nick Rhodes was 19 and Simon Le Bon was 23. So when you're that age, you're not necessarily, press trained. You're, and you're British, you're young, you're confident, you're shooting your mouth off. But over the years, they've gotten a lot more sort of, I don't even know what the word is. They're confident, but they're not, the cockiness has sort of gone away. It's a little bit more like they have more perspective now. They're really good about putting their legacy and their music kind of in context with what it was then and what it was now. And so, so they know it's good. I mean, I think it's one of those things where, it's assumed Rio's a great album. They know they made a great album. They don't necessarily have to talk about that anymore. And they're able to kind of talk about well, here's how we did it. Here's why we did it. This is why it matters. And it's interesting because John Taylor is very philosophical. You listen to interviews with him, and even in talking with him, he's very thoughtful. He's very much a little bit more, thematic. And then Nick Rhodes is the detailed one. He was the one who was mixing the record. He was the one that oversees a lot of things. So, his take on things will be different than John's because he's the one who was this is how I remember things. And so it's an interesting balance there too, because, it kind of brings different perspectives, and it also kind of balances out any potential well, I'm being over the top or anything like that. So you can see their individual personalities, I think, more now for sure.
Okay. There is the chapter here, Why Rio Matters.
Yes.
So I want to ask I think you go into good detail about why Rio matters, but my question is more along the lines of why does Duran Duran, the band, matter? That might be a little more overarching to that question, because you've outlined Rio. You've done an amazing job explaining why Rio matters. So I'll start with that. But why does Duran Duran, the band, matter, do you think?
How much time do we have? No, I mean, I love this question because there's so many different answers. I mean, first off, as a band, they really played for many teenagers in the early to mid 80s. They played this role for people that they were sort of, they were kind of like a comfort. They were sort of something that people could grab onto. I've heard so many stories from people that said, me and my friends, like Duran Duran was our thing. We would hang out, we would, talk about the band, we would fight over who was our favorite member. Right. So they were really this sort of bonding thing. And if you think about that, not every band has a fan base like that. I mean, you have bands that are popular, but they don't kind of inspire that kind of fervor. And so I think there's something really special about a band that you can really make those connections with fans. And you see this now. I mean, it's mind blowing to me even now, 40 years later, how many of those fans, those original fans, are still on board. But then there's also newer fans, they're younger fans. And so there's just something about the band that's really, it's really kind of transcended generations, which you also don't see a lot of bands from the 80s that do that. Honestly, the music just doesn't translate. The personalities don't, but Duran Duran has absolutely done that. Something you mentioned earlier about the way they kind of blended pop and rock, I think that's very important. You know, they were really kind of a bridge band between what was going on in the 70s, what was going to happen in the 80s, but they did it in such a way that felt natural. We joke sometimes about all the classic rock artists that went disco, or that decided to do a new wave record, and it sounds a little goofy. Duran Duran managed to kind of, probably because they were younger, managed to kind of bridge those generations. And the fact that they've continued innovating. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things about the band is that they're still making new music. They're still driven to make new music. They're releasing singles that I'm very much enjoying. I mean, how many bands that have been together for 40 years can you release singles and say, this is really good. Okay, I can listen to this again, and not like grade it on a curve a little bit. Like, oh, this is all right. They still have that creativity. They're the kind of artists that really are always pushing themselves. And I think that's also something really admirable and something that kind of makes them stand out too.
Okay. It's funny you mentioned just transcending generations. A friend of mine who I went to high school with, who also didn't like Duran Duran, married a woman who was a massive Duran Duran fan. Now, this friend of mine, he's very well off, and he got Duran Duran to play his wedding. So,
What?
yes, seriously. And that for me was just, that was an example of, this is a band that matters. If someone is that passionate about it, that they're going to get them, like, you need to play my wedding, and I need to get this for my wife. And that for me was just everything I needed to know about Duran Duran. It was another one of those things where, it's not grudging, but over time I've come to really appreciate Duran Duran for all the things that you mentioned, for their longevity and for their musicianship and just continuing ability to make great music. And, they have mellowed over time. So it's really interesting. So what was the most surprising or shocking thing you learned while you were researching this book? Something you're just like, wait a second, this can't be right. This is too weird.
A couple things. So I talked to the saxophonist who did the solo on Rio, because that was like one of the first people I reached out to after the band was like, you did the sax solo of the 80s. And he was lovely. And he said, he talked about how it's almost difficult to play because of the key it's in and the way it's sort of, it has how it interacts with like the rock music versus electronic music. He gave it in the, I have it in the book. He explained it in a theoretical way that made a lot of sense. But he also said that during practice once, he tried to kind of improvise on it. And the band was like, what are you doing? No, you don't improvise. This is how it's played. Like they had such a thought in their head about this is how the solo goes. This is how integral it is to the song, which I thought was really interesting because, you think about how many other bands that have those, iconic solos and you see them live and it's always this sort of thing that goes off in a different direction. It's a time, for people to improvise. And that was like, nope, this is part of the song. I think the other thing that was really interesting was, MTV launched in America in August of 1981. And then Rio came out in May of 1982. And MTV added Hungry Like the Wolf, the video, in early July of 1982, like the same week as the Go-Go's Vacation and a Fleetwood Mac Gypsy video. And that actually really surprised me because, Hungry Like the Wolf didn't become a hit in Canada and didn't become a hit in America until early 1983. That's when everything really took off. But MTV was so early on Duran Duran, like less than 2 months before the record came out, they had added the video into rotation. And so that was actually very surprising to me because that really showed, over the years you've heard, music videos made the band, music videos helped make them popular, but to kind of see that MTV really did support the band that soon, that really kind of hit home for me, that was, no exaggeration.
Well, I think that's possibly an example of the band making MTV, right?
Yeah.
Because those videos, they were not unlike any other band's videos. They were cinematic in the way they were produced, and I'm sure that MTV looked at that and thought, we have to play this. I realize that maybe they haven't broken here, but we have to play this because we know there's a fan base that's got to be out there, and it's just going to look great on MTV. I would think that's part of it. And I think you talk about, you know, their videos and video pioneers, and that was part of it. Part of pushing the sound was also understanding the era that they were in and the visuals that went along with it. You touched on it a little bit before. Maybe you can touch on it a little bit more now. I mean, these are good looking guys, and they didn't hide it in any way, shape, or form.
No, and you know, and that was also something that was really illuminating kind of doing research, is that when you start to really look at photos of Duran Duran and videos, you kind of trace it from like 81 to 82 and 83 as it got more successful. You can really track it by their hairstyles and their fashions. But they, and you know, and it's charming. It is very, very sweet and charming. But it's, you know, they all had like cool outfits, and they all had, you know, cutting edge outfits. They had those suits early on, you know, they looked good. And they were, you know, we're like, we need to dress up. We're in a band, you know, and in America, oh my God, and Canada too, I'm sure it was just like very low key, very much like, you know, besides Roxy Music, you know, and from England, you know, bands, it was all very casual. I mean, Duran Duran looked like they were from another planet. They were so, they looked so different. And I watched a lot of vintage videos, and there's a lot of MTV sort of, you know, vintage breaks and hours and stuff like that. And it's so striking now how different and just how in a good way they were. You know, some of the videos were kind of goofy that bands did, or they kind of did over the top stuff and kind of, you know, low budget. And Duran Duran comes out and they all look fantastic. And they're these mini movies, like it's just heads and tails above, you know, the performance videos people were doing, and the literal videos where it's like, oh, I'm singing about, you know, being outside. Look, it's a video where I'm outside. So they were really conceptual, and they were really, but they were also really smart. They understood the kind of the visual packaging of a band. And obviously, you know, bands like the Beatles and the Bee Gees and all sorts of bands had done that for them, but they really understood for the modern world, this is where things are going. Like, this is how we want to present ourselves. And they were really good at doing that.
And they were doing that before Rio, because just Girls on Film itself was like before that. And it was just so early. And so, I mean, they were smart about that too, because they knew, well, it'll be a little controversial here. Yes. And that's the kind of thing that's obviously going to get people watching and listening who maybe wouldn't necessarily do it otherwise. Right.
And sure enough, they got press. You know, when you look at like fall of 81, when they're getting press, it's talking about their controversial video. And, you know, and it was jumping off to talk about other things, but they were leading with like, defend yourselves. Girls on Film is, you know, playing in clubs, and it's not for, you know, it's too hot for TV. What is going on here?
Yeah. I've got a few more questions here before I'm going to turn it over to the Q&A section here. But so the last chapter in your book is Rio's impact and resonance. So you talk about a number of things, but if there is one thing you think that their biggest impact that they've had, what would be the one thing that you could choose that really struck you and you thought, you know, this is probably the thing? I know you maybe touched on that when I talked about Duran Duran, but specifically about Rio.
I mean, I think the biggest impact, I think, is, you know, this record, you know, I think now when you look at artists, they, you know, we talk about 360-degree record deals, and, you know, with you have artists that have social media, and then, you know, their album cover and video, and they have eras, and it's all very thematic. Duran Duran did that first. I mean, Rio was such a complete package. I mean, like, even behind you, you know, we have the Patrick Nagel. This was signifying this is a work of art. Yeah. And this is something that it's an entire package. You know, it's something that when you play it, you know, it's sequenced very well. When you see the videos, they're going to be high quality. You know, I think now we would call it, you know, the Rio era. You know, it was very much like aspirational. It was very thematic. It was all very methodical. And I think now we're almost used to that, because bands are just, that's what they do. That's what pop stars do. But Duran Duran were so good at sort of, you know, bringing out this entire package early on. And I think that really had an impact. I mean, you saw it in, you know, the bands in their wake realized we have to step up our game a little bit here. And
Right.
so I think that you still see that now. And I think, that's, I think, probably one of the biggest things is that they just really, that they knew kind of how to promote themselves and how to promote the music, but do it in such a way that was very smart and methodical and unified.
Okay. Do you have a favorite cover of a Duran Duran song? I know you touch on a few of them
Yes.
in that last chapter, but I mean, I'm always fascinated by covers and interpretations of songs by artists. So, is there one that you just think is either really strange or just another one that's just so beautiful, so wonderful, and you just love it?
That's a hard question. Because there are so many.
So
I
many.
keep finding covers. One of the songs I've always really liked, and it's kind of a goofy one, is Ben Lee and Kylie Minogue covered The Reflex on a very obscure Australian
Right.
tribute record in the late 90s. And I always really liked that. This band, The Wrens, who I really like, they covered The Seventh Stranger from Seven of the Ragged Tiger. And I like that because it's a moody song. They really capture the moodiness of that. But I'm those are just two offhand, but like I love too when they brought out Gerard Way to sing Planet Earth, when they did a David Lynch thing. They did this filming like a decade ago, and that was just, so he was playing with the band, so it's not really a cover, but it was kind of cool to see that generational passing. But I mean, ask me tomorrow. I mean, the Deftones cover The Chauffeur. Oh my God, how
Yes.
So
And Eagles of Death Metal.
exactly.
So
I mean,
that's the one for me. I'm just thinking that's the coolest, that the Eagles of Death Metal would be covering Duran Duran, or Duran Duran would have influenced them so much to the point where they would have said, we have to do that song.
And Jesse, and he came out with them at some point too, and played with them, which I thought was just so cool because that his mind was blown. He was so excited to be there.
Yeah. I love that. And I love that chapter just because there are so many stories in there and things that you touch on about how many bands today that you may not have realized have been so heavily influenced. And then I sat after, I'm like, of course. I mean, of course they have been. It makes perfect sense all the way through. Quickly, one last question for me here. How many Duran Duran shirts do you own?
That's a good question. So I'm wearing my new one. It's a Rum Runner shirt. I have a NASA shirt. I have a Rio shirt. I have a one from the Paper Gods tour. I have 5, 6, 7, maybe. And then I borrow my husband's sometimes. Oh yeah,
Right.
the hoodies were sold out. I was going to get a hoodie on the website and it's sold out. So at least 7, probably more. I can't help myself. When I see a cool shirt, I'm like, oh, they have another cool shirt. All right. I don't need any more band t-shirts, but like.
Hang on a second. There's no such thing as not needing any more band t-shirts.
I know.
Like,
I have 20 years of collecting. So I'm like, oh, maybe I need to get rid of some of these, but
right.
I had an eBay problem for a while. But I think my favorite is I have a vintage, back in the 90s, I got a vintage Wild Boys shirt. So it's like gray and like totally 80s. I don't know if it fits me anymore because it was definitely like small then, but it's the coolest shirt. It's so cool.
Yeah. You know what? Just remind me of Wild Boys. There's something about that song that I love. That song and The Living Daylights are songs that I just can't get out of my head when I think of Duran Duran. I don't know. There's something about them. They just seem so big, soaring, and epic in so many ways. But I'm drawn to those two songs. It's even now, even today.
It's like, Wild Boys is so great because of the production. And I think it's production and the drums. I mean, it's funny because that song is like such an outlier in their catalog. They never made another song that really sounded like it, but they were just really, they were just going for it on like all cylinders, basically.
Totally.
But no, I love that song too.
All right. Let's get to some of these questions that our audience here in the webinar has sent over. Sarah was the first person who sent over a question. She asked, what was your first concert and favorite concert?
So my first concert ever was REM and Luscious Jackson on the Monster Tour in 1995.
Come on.
That was that was pretty good start. I was my first love band forever and ever has been REM. And so that was my first concert. Favorite concert, honestly, I've seen so many, it's hard for me to pinpoint. But I mean, I saw amazing REM shows. I've seen some really good Duran Duran shows. I think maybe my last Duran Duran show was in Las Vegas before the pandemic. And I went, with my husband. It was so much fun. So that's kind of my last favorite concerts. I haven't been to as many in the last couple of years,
Right.
but gosh, I've just seen, I feel very blessed that I've seen so many amazing shows over the years from just like artists that you're like, are you kidding me? Like that you should, like, this is amazing.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I saw Queen from like pretty close to the stage a few years ago. That was pretty sweet. I'm going to admit that was pretty cool.
Just an aside to Sarah's question, what was the last show you saw before the pandemic? And have you seen one recently? Like, what was the last thing you saw?
So I think the last show I saw before the pandemic was last year, or was it 2020? Kristen Hirsch, John Doe from X, and Grantley Phillips did this like acoustic tour. And so they played this like venue in Cleveland. And so that I think was the last indoor show I saw. Steve Wynn from the Dream Syndicate played an outdoor acoustic show here a couple weeks ago. So that's the one show I've seen, but I bought Bob Dylan tickets today. So for a couple weeks. So fingers crossed. Yeah.
That's amazing. There's a couple questions here that are somewhat linked here. And this one's from Chloe. She says, how much of the success of Duran Duran was down to women? When I see them live nowadays, there's lots of intergenerational women there, mothers and daughters. I go with my mom. I find it pretty moving. So there's that question. And then there's another question here that is related to that. And it's all about, it's also about, I think I've lost it, unfortunately. Anyway, I apologize. There's a couple questions in here. I'll let you answer that question. I'll find that other question for you too.
First off, I love that question because I think I always find it very moving too when you have parents sharing, bands with their kids. I took my mom to see Duran Duran, hi mom, in 2000, and so it was, I find that extremely moving. And I think that really, I think women were such a driving force for Duran Duran. I mean, back in the day, they were very, careful, and they were very adamant about, we have fans that are like all genders, everyone comes to see us. But I think that teenage girls, especially, and women especially, were such a driving force for them, because they supported them. And, and one of the things about Duran Duran is that Rio especially, and I think it was Roger that said in the book that, that this was music that resonated with teenagers, but it wasn't a teenage record. It was definitely a dark record. It was very smart music. It didn't, pander to teenagers. It really treated things that were going on very seriously. And I think, when you're a teenage girl, like, people are jerks to you. People don't take you seriously, and Duran Duran really treated treated the fans well and really respected them. You could tell that. And so I think that really resonated. So there was a lot to that.
Okay. The related question, I found it here, is from an anonymous attendee. Can you please speak to the central role teenage girls have always played in shaping popular music?
100%. I mean, you go back to Elvis and everything in the 50s, and from then on, from the Beatles, and then you have you have Bay City Rollers, and you have everything in the 70s, the Bee Gees, and on to Duran Duran and onward. There's the line, the little girls understand. I think there's something to that teenage girls have always been sort of the tastemakers. And as I kind of say this in my book, teenage girls' tastes are always underestimated and always kind of diminished, even though, when they're the ones that are really picking up on things, they're the smart ones that are picking up on trends and picking up on there's greatness and there's things going on. And they're the ones that are really sort of propelling a lot of these artists, because they feel so deeply for them. Because, when you're a teenager in general, you feel so deeply about music. Music is everything to you a lot of times. And, especially teenage girls, you see these idols, and the music speaks to people in a kind of a deep way. And so they've always been so instrumental, even from, just from a emotional standpoint, a personal standpoint, but I mean, a commercial standpoint too, if you're spending your money, I mean, Duran Duran, especially, I mean, my God, their merchandising, they had so much stuff in the 80s, depending, you named it, you could have had anything. And so, there's that element too, which feels crass, but there's something to be said. You hang a poster on your wall, it makes you happy. I mean, that's the whole thing, is that Duran Duran's one of those bands that just bring a lot of joy, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm. Allison asks that Duran Duran has always loved and been highly influenced by Chic and Nile Rodgers. What other influential artists do you think would make great music with them who they have never collaborated with?
That is such a good question because, before like this whole cycle, I might have said, oh, Giorgio Moroder, but they did a new song with him called Tonight United. Um, you know, I don't think they've ever done anything with Brian Ferry, if I'm not mistaken, which is interesting because, they're such Roxy Music fans. And I'd be very curious to see what they might do with him, because I think now, when they were younger, I think it might have been a little bit weirder because, Brian was this kind of elder statesman. And, obviously Brian still is this kind of this elder statesman of British pop. But I'd be very curious about what modern day Duran Duran and Brian Ferry would do now. That would be kind of my guess.
That would be really cool, actually. Come to think of it, just thinking about that, that'd be amazing. Let's see here. Here's a question about your process. It's from Heloisa. How long did it take you to write the book? So you said you've been pitching that book for the past 12 years.
Yes.
But had you'd written parts of the book then? And how did you get into journalism and writing about music? She says she can identify with you because her musical tastes come from her parents' records and tapes. That's also how she became a Duranie.
So, I guess first off, the first part about how I got into journalism and writing about music, I got into that in school. When I was in junior high and high school, I was always on my school newspaper staff. And when I was in high school, my newspaper, I was editor in chief, and my newspaper didn't have an entertainment section. And I said, you know what, we need an entertainment section. And so I started an entertainment section. And one of the things I actually did was review Duran Duran's Medazzaland tour with a friend. So one of my first ever journalism clips, and I have a copy of it. I have not shared it online because it's a little bit embarrassing, but was a review of Duran Duran. And so that's always been something. I grew up reading music magazines. It's always been something I've really interested in. And so then in college and beyond, I had internships and started freelancing and kind of grew from there. In terms of how long it took me to write the book. I obviously had listened to the records so much over the years and, done research in the sense I've seen the band, I read interviews and things with them, but the actual writing, it was pretty much separate from anything that I had done in the past. And so between research, I would say it probably took me a year and a half, probably because I started doing interviews and then sitting down between interviews and research and then finishing the book and editing. It was a good long while, so because I just, it took, I had an original draft of the book that was far too long. And so I had to kind of edit things down, and I did over 50 interviews for this book. So I had a lot to work with. And so I was trying to figure out what made sense with that. So it took me a good long while.
So I know that reminds me of one thing, because I noticed in the notes that you didn't do interviews with everybody. Was Simon difficult to get a hold of, or is he just is he the strong silent type when it comes to talking about?
Probably a little bit of that, but
right.
I think if I remember correctly, and now it's kind of coming out because they're doing interviews for the new record. When I approached them to do interviews, they were like finishing what the record was going to be at the time, and I think Simon was like deep into writing lyrics, and obviously none of us knew a pandemic was going to be happening, and so I think they basically shut down everything and went home. And so when I made the ask, and they were, Simon, I think, was busy writing lyrics. Right. So, had I asked later, who knows? But yeah, I'm like, you know what? I didn't want to be the one that was going to, prevent the Duran Duran record, delay it by, ruining the creative process. So I was like, not me, not going to be me.
No, do not be that person.
Yeah.
And we've got a question here from David McPherson. Shout out Waterloo. As a fellow author and writer with a book coming out in the next month, he's curious to know what's next. Do you have plans for another book, another 33 and a third title, or another subject you're looking to explore? And on a side note, he says, I can't believe that your parents never told you to turn down your music. You must have been playing music they liked.
Mostly. I know there were some records, they did not like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Blood Sugar Sex Magik. I was not a fan of that, but which was okay. I had that, I think every kid had that, but then I think, I got tired of it. So I have a manuscript. I'm working on a book on the B-52s, basically why the B-52s matter. And so I have a manuscript that I'm in the process of revising right now. I do, though, in the spring so I got contracted to do this like Lady Gaga biography that's very like photo heavy. So I have a Lady Gaga book coming out in like the spring, I believe. It's kind of a coffee table book. So I wrote like, a bio on her. So I'm very excited about that too, because it's going to look super cool. So
That is-
that's coming out, I think, next.
All right. An artist, just jumping off from that, someone you would love to write about that you haven't had a chance to do so yet, who would it be?
Oh man. That's a really good question. I mean, I've had the good fortune of writing about a lot of music, a lot of my faves. I would love to do like a book length something on the Tori Amos. I'm a big Tori Amos fan.
Mm.
And so I'd love to do something book length on that, and or, Kate Bush. I think there's something kind of really interesting just in general about the women of the 80s. I think there's a lot of really interesting personalities. One person I've never interviewed is Annie Lennox, and I've always wanted to interview Annie Lennox because I think she's fantastic, and she's been, doing her pandemic like piano recitals that I'm just like, oh my God, you sound amazing and you're in your living room. So I'd love to interview her one day. She's kind of on my bucket list. I'd love to write about her.
Well, I would look very forward to reading that. Annie, thank you so much. The book is wonderful, by the way. If you're interested in more 33 1/3 books, you can get them at Kitchener Public Library. It's been a pleasure talking to you and getting to know more about you and your work on the book. So I look forward to your next book, whatever it may be, whether it's a 33 1/3 or whatever may be next. So thank you for joining us here as part of the 33 1/3 series.
Thank you so much for the questions and for having me. This has been really awesome.
Carlos, thanks for your time tonight and using your skills to chat with Annie and guide the conversation. We
My pleasure.
appreciate you participating in our 85 Queen event, and it's always enjoyable listening to you in your element. So thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure and an honor. So thanks for asking.
You're welcome. Thank you. Annie, what a fabulous conversation. I could listen for another hour to your stories and the vast knowledge you have of the band and the album. Thank you again for taking the time to virtually visit us in Kitchener. I just wanted to share in preparation for tonight's event, along with reading the book, I spent some time going back and watching the music videos with new eyes now that I have that context and backstory from your book about how the videos are filmed. So it's great to like go back and look at something super old that's new again. So thank you. And a special thanks from me and a little bit with Carlos too, a dig. I was 13 in 1982 as well. And I was Team John all the way.
Yes.
And Annie, from your book, I feel vindicated that it was, and it still is okay to be a fan. And when they tour again, maybe we'll bump into each other at a concert in Cleveland or Toronto.
I'll be in Cleveland if they're here. Come
Excellent.
on down. We'll show you
I might cross the border for that. Carlos and you talked about the library and the time you spent. In closing, I just want to read that short piece from the introduction of Annie's book. Annie writes, as a pre-internet teenager with limited spending money, I expanded my mind in the audiovisual section of my beloved local library. The hushed media room was a cultural oasis from where I borrowed a well-loved copy of Rio, and at home, I dubbed Rio onto a blank cassette, writing out the album title in bubble letters on the J card, end quote. Or we had our finger on the record button while the DJ talked over the beginning of the song that we wanted to capture. Sorry, Carlos.
Okay.
Listening has come a long way from our cassettes to CDs to Spotify and Apple Music, but all along there's been vinyl. And libraries have come a long way. And I want to share a teaser with our viewers tonight that Kitchener Library will be launching our own vinyl collection later this fall. So stay tuned for more details. And to tonight's audience, our super fans, thank you for choosing to spend some time with us and for all of your many questions. One lucky viewer will receive a copy of Annie's book, and we will contact you by email tomorrow. I'd like to thank Wordsworth Books for their ongoing support of our author events. Copies of Rio are in stock, and they're kindly offering a discount if you mention attending this event. And as we do with all of our 85 Queen events, we will be posting this event on our YouTube channel. So when we invite you to share it, watch it again, and let others know. Thanks to each of you for joining us tonight. Carlos and Annie, thank you again for your time. Have a great weekend, good night, and see everyone soon.